On the morning of November 28, 1953, a man fell from the window of room 1018A at the Statler Hotel in Midtown Manhattan and died on the sidewalk of 7th Avenue. The man was 37 years old. He had a wife in Maryland and 3 children under the age of 10. His name was Frank Olson, and he was a scientist employed by the United States Army at a biological research facility in Frederick, Maryland, called Camp Dietrich. The CIA told the Army he had jumped. The Army told his wife Alice that Frank had suffered a nervous breakdown and taken his own life. Alice Olson was given a flag and a pension and a death that the government had already decided to call a suicide before the body was cold. She accepted this because she had no reason not to, because she had no way of knowing that 9 days before her husband fell from that window, a CIA officer named Sidney Gottlieb had secretly dissolved a quantity of lysergic acid diethylamide into Frank Olson's after-dinner liqueur at a EL government retreat in rural Maryland, and that Frank Olson had spent the last 9 days of his life in a state of acute psychological crisis that the CIA had caused, monitored, mismanaged, and then, in the account that his family and a growing body of forensic and documentary evidence would spend the next 7 decades assembling, ended. Alice Olson lived until 1993. She never stopped believing her husband had killed himself, not because the evidence supported that conclusion, but because no one who knew the truth had told her otherwise, and by the time the truth began to surface, she was an old woman who had built 40 years of grief around an explanation the government had manufactured in a hotel room in 1953 before her husband's body was cold on the pavement. To understand what happened to Frank Olson, you have to understand what kind of man he was before the CIA reached him, and what kind of institution Camp Dietrich was, and what the relationship between that institution and the Central Intelligence Agency looked like in the early years of the Cold War, when both organizations were young and frightened and willing to do things that neither would have been comfortable explaining to the American public. Frank Olson was born in 1910 in Hurley, Wisconsin, the son of a mill worker. He was academically gifted in a way that small Midwestern towns in the early 20th century did not always know what to do with, and he worked his way through the University of Wisconsin on scholarships and part-time jobs, earning his doctorate in biochemistry in 1943. By that point, the war had been running for 2 years, and the Army's need for scientists with Olson's specific combination of skills, a deep understanding of how biological agents behaved in living tissue and in the air, was urgent and growing. Olson went to Camp Dietrich in 1943 as part of the Army's wartime biological weapons program, and he stayed after the war ended because the work continued, and because he was good at it, and because the intellectual environment at Dietrich in the late 1940s, whatever one thought of its ultimate purposes, was genuinely stimulating for a man of his training and temperament. He and Alice bought a house in Frederick, Maryland, a few miles from the base. They had 3 children, Eric, Lisa, and Niels. Olson coached Little League. He was, by the accounts of everyone who knew him before 1953, an ordinary man living an ordinary life that happened to take place inside a classified military facility working on weapons the public was not told about. Camp Dietrich in the late 1940s and early 1950s was one of the most consequential and least discussed facilities in the American national security apparatus. The Army had established it in 1943 specifically to develop biological weapons as a counterpart to the chemical and biological programs the Axis powers were known or suspected to be running. By the end of the war, Dietrich had several thousand employees working on weaponization of anthrax, botulinum toxin, brucellosis, and other agents, and had developed delivery systems capable of dispersing these agents from aircraft over large areas. The program did not end when Germany and Japan surrendered. It accelerated because the Soviet Union had its own biological weapons program, and because the emerging Cold War logic held that any gap in capability between the United States and the USSR was a security threat that had to be closed regardless of the legal or moral questions involved. The Biological Weapons Convention would not exist until 1972. In the 1940s and 1950s, biological weapons development was not prohibited by international law, and the Army pursued it with the methodical thoroughness it brought to every weapons program. Frank Olson's specific contribution was in aerobiology, the study of how biological agents behave when suspended in air, how they drift, how they survive, how they reach their targets. This was fundamental knowledge for anyone trying to design an effective biological weapon delivery system, and it made Olson one of Dietrich's more valuable researchers. The relationship between Camp Dietrich and the CIA was established in the late 1940s and deepened through the early 1950s as both organizations confronted the same basic problem from different angles. The CIA needed chemical and biological agents that could be used in covert operations, interrogations, and what the agency called behavior modification programs. Camp Dietrich had the facilities, the expertise, and the security infrastructure to produce and test such agents. The arrangement that developed was called the Special Operations Division, a unit within Dietrich that worked directly with the CIA on programs that were classified separately from Dietrich's regular Army work and that had a different chain of accountability. Frank Olson worked in the Special Operations Division. He had clearances that went beyond his regular Army work. He traveled on behalf of the CIA and the division to facilities in Europe and possibly elsewhere where joint American and Allied intelligence programs were being conducted. The nature of those programs, and specifically what Olson witnessed during those travels, is the knot at the center of his story that has never been fully untied. The story of Frank Olson cannot be understood without understanding what the CIA was doing in 1953, and what it was doing in 1953 cannot be understood without understanding what the agency believed the Soviet Union and China were doing to American prisoners of war in Korea. The reports coming out of the Korean War in the early 1950s described American prisoners making public confessions of crimes they had not committed. Statements of such apparent sincerity and such detailed consistency that American intelligence analysts concluded the Soviets had developed some method of psychological manipulation that went beyond ordinary coercion. The word that entered the public vocabulary was brainwashing. The CIA's response was a program called MKUltra, formally authorized in April of 1953 by CIA Director Allen Dulles, and run by a chemist named Sidney Gottlieb out of the agency's technical services staff. The program's stated purpose was to develop methods of mind control, behavioral manipulation, and coercive interrogation that could match or exceed whatever the Soviets were assumed to possess. Its actual scope, documented in the fraction of its records that survived a 1973 destruction order, encompassed 150 separate research projects conducted at 80 institutions, including universities, hospitals, prisons, and military facilities, involving the unwitting administration of drugs, including LSD, mescaline, barbiturates, and amphetamines, to subjects who had not consented and in many cases did not know they were being experimented on. MKUltra did not emerge from nowhere. It was the formalization of experiments that had been running in more ad hoc form since at least 1950 under a predecessor program called Project Artichoke, which had itself grown out of a program called Project Bluebird. The CIA's interest in chemical means of controlling human behavior predated MKUltra by years, and the institutional culture that made MKUltra possible, a culture in which the strategic imperatives of the Cold War overrode ethical constraints that would have been considered basic in any other context, had been developing throughout the late 1940s. Sidney Gottlieb was the man the CIA chose to run this program, and understanding Gottlieb is essential to understanding how MKUltra functioned and why it produced the consequences it did. Gottlieb was born in 1918 in the Bronx, the son of Jewish immigrants from Hungary, and he was, by any conventional measure, an impressive intellect. He earned a doctorate in biochemistry from California Institute of Technology in 1943. The same year, Olson went to Camp Detrick, and he joined the CIA in 1951 as chief of the chemical division within the technical services staff. He was a complex and contradictory figure. He raised goats on a farm in rural Virginia. He practiced folk dancing. He did volunteer work in India in his later years, and for 22 years he ran a program that involved drugging unwitting American citizens, directing the torture of prisoners, and presiding over at least one death. These qualities coexisted in Gottlieb without apparent tension, because the Cold War created an institutional framework in which they could coexist, in which the folk dancer and the interrogation program director were both expressions of a single man's commitment to what he understood as the defense of the free world. Gottlieb believed, or convinced himself that he believed, that what MKUltra was doing was necessary, and the CIA's institutional structure never provided a mechanism that might have challenged that belief. He reported to the Director of Central Intelligence. The Director reported to the President. No one in that chain had an interest in examining too closely what Gottlieb was doing in the agency's name. Frank Olson's connection to MKUltra ran through his work at Camp Detrick's Special Operations Division, which was the Army's primary biological weapons research facility and which had a relationship with the CIA that was close, classified, and in certain dimensions never fully disclosed, even in the congressional investigations that came later. Olson was a specialist in aerobiology, the science of how biological agents behave when dispersed through the air, which made him valuable to programs that were exploring the weaponization of anthrax, botulinum toxin, and other agents. He held a top-secret clearance. He traveled to European facilities where, according to accounts his son Eric Olson would later develop from interviews with former intelligence officers, he had witnessed interrogations in which captured Soviet and other foreign subjects had been administered experimental compounds and, in at least some accounts, had died as a result. The specific locations Eric Olson identified through his research included a facility in West Germany and possibly a site in Britain connected to British intelligence, where joint American and Allied interrogation programs were being conducted using techniques developed in part from MKUltra research. What Olson saw at these facilities has never been officially confirmed, but the pattern of what Eric Olson assembled from interviews with former intelligence figures over decades pointed consistently toward the same conclusion. Frank Olson had seen people die during CIA-connected interrogation operations, and he had not been able to make peace with what he had seen. The question of when Olson's distress began, whether it preceded the LSD dosing or was caused by it, is one that the surviving record does not resolve cleanly. Alice Olson told Eric years later that Frank had seemed troubled for some time before the Deep Creek Lake retreat, that he had been sleeping poorly and was withdrawn in ways that were not characteristic of him. Colleagues at Detrick recalled that Olson had expressed reservations about the direction of the program's work. One account, developed by researcher H.P. Albarelli from interviews with former intelligence figures, suggested that Olson had specifically told a supervisor that he wanted to leave Detrick and that he was considering going public with concerns about what the Special Operations Division was doing. If this account is accurate, it would mean that the CIA had reason to regard Frank Olson as a potential security problem before the Deep Creek Lake meeting, and that the LSD dosing that took place at that meeting was not a random experiment in group dynamics, but a targeted intervention in the psychology of a man the agency was already watching carefully. This is the version of events that Eric Olson came to believe, and it is the version that transforms the Deep Creek Lake episode from a reckless experiment into the opening act of something more deliberate. The retreat at Deep Creek Lake, Maryland, took place on November 18th and 19th, 1953. It was a working meeting organized by the CIA's Chemical Division, attended by a group of scientists from Camp Dietrich, including Frank Olson and a CIA officer named Robert Lashbrook, who would later be identified as Gottlieb's deputy in the MKUltra program. The cabin at Deep Creek Lake was isolated, surrounded by forest, the kind of location that intelligence organizations used for meetings they did not want to appear in any building's visitor log. On the evening of November 19th, after dinner, Gottlieb prepared a bottle of Cointreau liqueur and added to it a quantity of LSD. He then offered the liqueur to the group. Approximately 20 minutes after drinking it, Olson and several others began to experience the effects of the drug. The dosing was not disclosed to the participants until approximately 30 minutes after they had consumed the liqueur, at which point Gottlieb informed the group of what had been added. The CIA's internal account of this event, produced after the fact, described it as an experiment in group dynamics under the influence of LSD, and characterized Olson's reaction as more pronounced than those of the other participants. This was, by any reasonable standard, a criminal assault. The participants had not consented. The drug had been concealed in their food. The CIA classified the entire episode for 20 years. What the CIA's internal account does not address, and what has never been explained, is why Gottlieb chose that particular evening, that particular group, and that particular individual who was already showing signs of distress about the program's direction. LSD in 1953 was not the culturally familiar substance it would become in the 1960s. It had been synthesized by Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann at Sandoz Laboratories in 1938, and its psychoactive properties discovered, accidentally, in 1943. By the early 1950s, it was known primarily within a small circle of researchers and had attracted the attention of the CIA specifically because of its potential applications in interrogation and behavior modification. The agency had obtained quantities of LSD from Sandoz and was conducting experiments to determine whether it could be used to destabilize a subject's psychological defenses, to make a resistant prisoner suddenly cooperative, or to induce a state of confusion and suggestibility in which information could be extracted or false information implanted. The results of these experiments were mixed and often alarming. LSD did not reliably produce the effects the CIA wanted. What it reliably produced was extreme psychological distress in subjects who did not know they had been given it, who had no framework for understanding what was happening to their perception and cognition, and who sometimes experienced what clinicians would later call a bad trip of sufficient severity to require hospitalization. Frank Olson experienced something in this range at Deep Creek Lake, and then he was driven home to Frederick, Maryland, and told to rest, and the CIA's management of what it had done to him began. In the days following the retreat, Olson's behavior alarmed his colleagues and his family. He told his wife he had made a terrible mistake. He told a colleague he wanted to leave his job. He was erratic, withdrawn, unable to sleep. Alice Olson would recall that Frank seemed to be trying to tell her something, but could not get the words out, that he circled around whatever it was he needed to say without ever arriving at it. In the weeks before Deep Creek Lake, he had been quieter than usual. After the retreat, he was frightened in a way that Alice, who had lived with this man for a decade, did not recognize. She did not know about the LSD. She did not know about MKUltra. She did not know about the Special Operations Division's European operations. She knew only that her husband was not himself, and that the Army and CIA contacts who called the house in the days after the retreat seemed oddly attentive for people who were supposed to be managing a nervous breakdown in a routine way. The CIA's response to the crisis it had created was to send Olson to New York City to be evaluated by a physician named Harold Abramson, who was not a psychiatrist, but was an allergist with a CIA contract and a security clearance, and a working relationship with the MKUltra program. Abramson was, in other words, exactly the kind of doctor the CIA would send to manage a problem it could not expose to outside scrutiny. He had no training in treating psychotic breaks induced by hallucinogenic drugs. He had every reason to keep his patient's condition and its cause within the boundaries of the CIA's security apparatus. Abramson met with Olson several times in New York and prescribed him a combination of bourbon and Nembutal, which is a barbiturate, as a treatment for what he diagnosed as a psychotic episode. He did not refer Olson to a hospital. He did not contact Olson's family. He reported to the CIA. On one of the New York visits, Lashbrook took Olson to see a Broadway show, which was described in CIA internal documents as part of the therapeutic program, as if an evening at the theater were a standard clinical intervention for a man in the grip of an acute psychological crisis following involuntary LSD exposure. The CIA also arranged for Olson to be seen by a magician and hypnotist named John Mulholland, who had a contract with the agency related to developing techniques for covert drug administration, and whose specific qualifications for treating Frank Olson's condition were, to put it charitably, non-existent. The accumulation of these details, the allergist, the bourbon, the Broadway show, the magician, reads less like a treatment plan and more like a management strategy, an effort to keep Olson contained and monitored within the CIA's security perimeter, while the agency decided what to do about the problem he represented. The question of why the CIA chose to manage Olson's deteriorating condition through a cleared contractor rather than through conventional psychiatric care is one the agency has never answered to anyone's satisfaction, and it is the question that sits at the center of the family's argument that what happened to Frank Olson was not a suicide. On the night of November 27, 1953, Frank Olson was in room 1018A of the Statler Hotel in Manhattan with Robert Lashbrook, the CIA officer who had been assigned to accompany him throughout the New York treatment period. Lashbrook was in one of the room's 2 beds. Olson was in the other. At approximately 2 in the morning, according to Lashbrook's account, he was awakened by the sound of breaking glass and found that Olson was gone and the window was broken. He called the hotel operator and said, in the words the operator reported, that his friend had just gone out the window. He did not say he did not know what had happened. He did not say he had been asleep. He said his friend had gone out the window, and then he called a number that investigators would later identify as Sidney Gottlieb's home phone. The sequence of those 2 calls, hotel operator first, then Gottlieb's home rather than emergency services, is one of the details that has attracted the most sustained attention from researchers and investigators over the decades. A man who has just witnessed his roommate apparently fall or jump from a hotel window calls the building's front desk and then calls his CIA supervisor. He does not call an ambulance. He does not call the police. He calls Sidney Gottlieb. The police arrived. The CIA arrived, in the person of a senior officer named James Angleton, before the police had finished their initial investigation. Angleton was the CIA's counterintelligence chief, which was not the position from which one would normally expect a response to a hotel suicide. Angleton removed documents from the room. The medical examiner ruled the death a suicide within hours, without a toxicology screen, and without waiting for the results of any forensic analysis. Frank Olson was buried in Maryland. His wife was told he had jumped. The cover-up that followed was not elaborate in its design. It was sustained primarily by classification. The CIA's records of the Deep Creek Lake dosing, the Abramson treatment, Lashbrook's presence in the room, and the entire MKUltra program were classified at the highest levels, and they remained classified for 2 decades, during which time Alice Olson raised 3 children on a government pension, and Frank Olson's death remained officially a suicide committed by a man who had suffered a spontaneous mental breakdown. The exposure began not with the Olson family, but with a newspaper. In 1974, investigative journalist Seymour Hersh published a story in the New York Times, reporting that the CIA had conducted domestic operations involving illegal surveillance and experimentation on American citizens. The story triggered a Senate investigation led by Frank Church of Idaho, and the Church Committee's work in 1975 began pulling on threads that eventually led to MKUltra. The CIA's director at the time, William Colby, made a calculation that other directors before him had not made, that cooperating with the congressional investigation and disclosing what he could was preferable to the alternative, which was the uncontrolled exposure of programs that were already partially visible to investigators. Colby made the decision to inform the White House of the Olson case specifically, and in the summer of 1975, Frank Olson's family was summoned to meet with President Gerald Ford in the Oval Office. Ford apologized. CIA Director William Colby gave the family a classified summary of what the CIA knew about Frank Olson's death. The family accepted a financial settlement of $750,000 and a private bill passed by Congress. They were not given the full file. They were not told what Frank Olson had seen before he died. They were given an apology and money and the same suicide ruling the government had produced in 1953. Colby's decision to cooperate with the Church Committee was considered inside the intelligence community a serious and controversial act of institutional disloyalty. He was fired by President Ford in November of 1975 in what became known as the Halloween Massacre, a reorganization that also removed Secretary of Defense James Schlesinger and replaced Colby with George H.W. Bush. The reorganization was widely interpreted as an effort to contain the damage from the ongoing investigations, and whatever its intent, its effect was that the most direct official source of information about what had actually happened in MKUltra's most sensitive operations was removed from his position before the investigations were complete. Eric Olson was 9 years old when his father died. He was in his early 30s when the government called the family to the Oval Office, and he accepted the settlement and the apology and returned to his life. But something in the partial disclosure had unsettled rather than resolved him. The CIA's account of what had happened acknowledged the LSD dosing and expressed regret for it, but it rested entirely on Lashbrook's version of the night of November 27th, and Lashbrook's version had details that Eric Olson found increasingly difficult to accept as the years passed, and his understanding of what his father had been working on deepened. The admission that the CIA had drugged his father without consent should have been the end of the story, the revelation that explained everything. For Eric Olson, it was the beginning, because the more he learned about MKUltra and the Special Operations Division and his father's travels and his father's state of mind in the months before Deep Creek Lake, the more the CIA's account began to look like a partial truth designed to foreclose further inquiry rather than a complete account designed to achieve it. Over the following years and then decades, Eric Olson made Frank Olson's death the central project of his intellectual and personal life. He abandoned a career in clinical psychology. He converted the family home in Frederick, Maryland, into something approaching a research archive on his father's case. He obtained documents through Freedom of Information Act requests, traveled to Europe to interview former intelligence figures, corresponded with researchers on multiple continents, and assembled a picture of Frank Olson's final weeks that differed from the official account in ways that grew more specific and more troubling the more evidence he gathered. The picture Eric Olson assembled was of a man who had been identified as a security risk because of what he had witnessed, who had been managed rather than treated after the LSD dosing, and who had been killed in that hotel room by someone who then staged the scene to resemble a suicide. The MKUltra program's full scope has never been established because the records were destroyed. What is known from the surviving documents and from congressional testimony is that the program ran from 1953 to at least 1973 and involved research into hypnosis, sensory deprivation, electroconvulsive therapy, psychosurgery, psychological harassment, and the administration of numerous chemical compounds including LSD, mescaline, heroin, barbiturates, and others. Research was conducted on prisoners at federal penitentiaries, on patients at psychiatric hospitals, on military personnel, and on civilians recruited under false pretenses. The surviving documents describe experiments in which subjects were kept in isolation for weeks, in which individuals were given LSD daily for extended periods to study the effects of prolonged exposure, and in which electroconvulsive therapy was combined with drug administration in ways that caused permanent psychological damage to some participants. A CIA operation called Midnight Climax established safe houses in San Francisco and New York, where CIA officers paid prostitutes to lure men to the houses, administered LSD to them without their knowledge, and observed their behavior through one-way mirrors. The operation ran for several years. Its director, a CIA officer named George White, kept a diary that described the work with a casual enthusiasm that becomes more disturbing the longer you read it. White wrote about the pleasures of watching people unknowingly drugged, about the interesting behavior that resulted, about the operational insights the program generated. He seemed to experience no tension between the ethics of what he was doing and the recreational pleasure he derived from doing it. The subjects of Midnight Climax were chosen specifically because they were unlikely to complain to authorities. Men who had been with prostitutes, men with criminal records, men at the margins of respectable society. They had no recourse and no voice, and the CIA knew it. The institutional framework that made all of this possible was not a secret conspiracy in the dramatic sense. It was a bureaucratic structure in which the Cold War's existential framing, the Soviet Union as an adversary that would use any method available to it, justified the preemptive abandonment of constraints that the United States publicly claimed to honor. The Nuremberg Code, which the United States had helped write following the trials of Nazi doctors for human experimentation, established informed consent as an absolute and non-negotiable requirement for medical experimentation on human subjects. It was adopted in 1947. MKUltra began in 1953. The CIA's lawyers and its leadership were aware of the Nuremberg Code. Sidney Gottlieb was a scientist who had been trained in the same academic tradition that produced the code. The decision to proceed with non-consensual human experimentation was not made in ignorance of these standards. It was made in the explicit belief that the Cold War emergency superseded them, that the Soviet threat was so severe and the necessity of matching Soviet capabilities so urgent that ordinary ethical constraints had to be suspended. This is the argument that every intelligence program that has violated the rights of its own citizens has made, and it is an argument that becomes more dangerous rather than less the more sincerely it is believed. The forensic turning point came in 1994. Frank Olson, working with a legal team and eventually with the support of the state's attorney's office in Frederick County, Maryland, obtained a court order to exhume his father's body. Frank Olson had been buried in Frederick for 41 years. The examination was conducted by James Starrs, a forensic scientist from George Washington University, who had led several high-profile historical exhumation cases and who approached the Olson examination with the methodical rigor his reputation required. Starrs assembled a team that included forensic pathologists, forensic anthropologists, and other specialists, and the examination took place under conditions designed to produce findings that could withstand legal scrutiny. What Starrs found when he examined Frank Olson's remains contradicted the 1953 suicide ruling in specific and documentable ways. There was a hematoma on the left side of Olson's skull, above the left eye, consistent with a blunt force impact. This injury could not have been caused by the fall itself, because the physics of a fall from a 10th floor window and the geometry of landing on a Manhattan sidewalk do not produce injuries on the upper front of the skull. A person falling forward from a window at that height and traveling that distance lands primarily on the lower extremities, the pelvis, and the torso. The skull injury Starrs found was consistent with having been struck with a blunt object before going through the window, not after landing on the pavement. Starrs also found that the pattern of injuries on Olson's body was inconsistent with the broken glass of the window, suggesting that Olson had not been conscious or struggling when he went through it, that he had gone through the window as a passive body rather than as a man who had thrown himself or fallen. Starrs concluded that the death was consistent with a homicide, staged to appear as a suicide. He was careful, as forensic scientists are careful, to say consistent with rather than proof of, but the conclusion was unambiguous in its direction. Frank Olson had almost certainly been struck in the head before he went through that window. The Manhattan District Attorney's Office opened a homicide investigation in 1994 following the Starrs examination. The investigation was led by a prosecutor named Stephen Sirocco, who pursued it with genuine seriousness for several years, interviewing surviving witnesses including Robert Lashbrook, seeking additional documents from the CIA and other agencies, and attempting to build a criminal case that could be taken before a grand jury. The investigation ran into the same obstacle that every investigation into MKUltra and the Olson case had run into: the CIA's records. The agency had destroyed the bulk of its MKUltra files in 1973 on the orders of then Director Richard Helms, specifically in anticipation of congressional scrutiny. Helms ordered the destruction after learning that a congressional investigation was imminent, and the timing was precise enough that it is difficult to characterize it as anything other than deliberate obstruction of the oversight process. What survived was a fraction of the original documentation, recovered only because a batch of financial records had been misfiled in a different record system and escaped the purge. The surviving records, perhaps 2% of what had originally existed, were what the Church Committee and subsequent researchers worked from. Sirocco's investigation ultimately did not produce charges. The surviving witnesses were old, their memories inconsistent, and the physical evidence, while strongly suggestive, fell short of the evidentiary standard required for a criminal prosecution. Lashbrook, when interviewed by Sirocco's team, maintained the account he had given to police in 1953. He had been asleep. He had heard glass breaking. He had found the window open and Olson gone. He offered no explanation for the sequence of his phone calls that night. The case remains officially open in the Manhattan District Attorney's records. No one has ever been charged with the death of Frank Olson. It is, by most accounts, the oldest open homicide investigation in Manhattan's history. Sidney Gottlieb left the CIA in 1973. He destroyed his own files before leaving, a detail that is not incidental. The man who ran MKUltra ensured that the most detailed record of the program's operations, his own working files accumulated over 22 years, did not survive his departure. He retired to a farm in rural Virginia, spent time doing volunteer medical work in India, and returned to Virginia, where he lived quietly for the remaining decades of his life. He was deposed in civil litigation brought by survivors of MKUltra experiments and gave testimony in those proceedings that was notable for the frequency with which he claimed to have no memory of specific events and programs he had directed for years. He testified that he could not recall the details of experiments that were documented in the surviving CIA records. He testified that he did not remember specific individuals whose treatment he had authorized. He said, under oath, that his memory of the period was poor. This testimony protected him legally because memory failure, genuine or claimed, is not perjury, and because the records that might have contradicted his claimed amnesia had been destroyed by his own hand in 1973. Gottlieb died in January of 1999, 2 weeks after a journalist named H.P. Albarelli Jr. had located him and obtained a brief interview. Gottlieb was 80 years old. He had lived his entire post-CIA life without legal accountability for a program that had involved the non-consensual drugging of hundreds of American and foreign subjects, the deaths of at least one and possibly more individuals, and a systematic program of human experimentation that violated every principle of medical ethics that the post-war world had established. Robert Lashbrook, the CIA officer who was in the room when Frank Olson died, lived until 2014. He gave very few interviews in the decades following Olson's death and the subsequent investigations. In the accounts he did give, his version of the night remained consistent with the statement he had provided to police in 1953. He had been asleep. He had been awakened by breaking glass. Olson was gone. He never provided a satisfactory explanation for why his first substantive call after discovering that his companion had apparently just fallen from a 10th floor window was to Sidney Gottlieb's home phone rather than to emergency services. He was never charged with anything. He died at the age of 92 in California, having outlived nearly everyone else who had been present at Deep Creek Lake in November of 1953. And whatever he knew about the night of November 27th, he did not disclose it publicly before he died. The question of what Frank Olson had specifically witnessed that may have made him a liability remains the most significant unresolved element of his case. Eric Olson's research, conducted over decades and involving interviews with former intelligence figures on both sides of the Atlantic, produced accounts suggesting that Olson had been present at a facility in Europe, with some accounts pointing to West Germany and others to a British site, where CIA and military interrogators had used biological and chemical agents on prisoners, and where at least some of those prisoners had died as a result. If true, this would have meant that Olson was not merely a witness to MKUltra's domestic drug experiments, which were damaging enough in their own right, but was a direct witness to what amounted to murder conducted under official American intelligence auspices in the early years of the Cold War. The implications of that testimony, if Olson had ever provided it, would have extended far beyond any individual's liability. It would have implicated the CIA, the Army, and their British counterparts in wartime-style conduct during peacetime, in the deaths of foreign nationals subjected to experimental interrogation procedures, in a systematic program of lethal human experimentation, conducted not in a declared war, but in the quiet years of the early 1950s, when the American public believed its government was operating within the boundaries the Nuremberg trials had established. A man who carried that knowledge, who was showing signs of psychological breakdown, who had expressed a desire to leave his position, who might go to a journalist or a congressional staffer, or simply talk to the wrong person at a dinner party, that man was, in the security calculus of the early CIA, a problem of the most serious kind. The 1977 Senate hearings on MKUltra, which followed the 1975 Church Committee disclosures and went into greater depth on the program's specific operations, produced testimony from former CIA officials and research subjects that filled in some of the program's outlines without resolving its most consequential questions. Senator Edward Kennedy chaired the subcommittee that conducted the 1977 hearings, and the testimony produced included accounts from individuals who had been unwittingly drugged in various MKUltra experiments and who described the lasting psychological damage those experiences had caused. The hearings also produced testimony from CIA officials who defended the program's purposes while acknowledging that its methods had sometimes exceeded acceptable boundaries, a formulation that captured the institutional doublethink that had allowed the program to run for 22 years. The hearings generated significant press coverage and public outrage, but did not result in criminal charges, because the statute of limitations had run on most of the relevant conduct, and because the destroyed records made prosecution of specific individuals difficult to impossible. What the hearings did establish, definitively and on the public record, was that the CIA had conducted systematic, non-consensual human experimentation on American citizens for over 2 decades, that it had done so with the knowledge and authorization of senior agency leadership, and that the individuals responsible had faced no legal consequences for any of it. The Frank Olson case sits at the intersection of all of these larger histories, and its persistence as an unresolved question reflects something specific about what it asks. The MKUltra program can be acknowledged, documented, and officially regretted without anyone going to prison. The non-consensual LSD experiments can be characterized as the product of a different era with different standards, as failures of institutional ethics rather than individual criminal conduct, as the kind of thing that a properly functioning oversight structure would have prevented. The Frank Olson case cannot be processed through this framework, because the framework requires that the conduct being regretted fall within a range of actions that, however unethical, do not include murder. If Frank Olson was killed deliberately in that hotel room by or at the direction of the CIA, then what happened in room 1018A of the Statler Hotel is not an institutional ethics failure. It is a homicide. It falls into a different legal category, a different moral category, a different historical category than everything else MKUltra has been made to represent. This is why the CIA's position has remained consistent across 7 decades. Frank Olson jumped. The LSD caused a psychotic episode. The death was a tragedy, but not a crime, because the alternative, acknowledging what the forensic evidence suggests and what Eric Olson's research implies, would require the government to admit that it murdered one of its own scientists to protect a secret, and no administration in 7 decades has been willing to do that. What remains is the accumulation, a hematoma above the left eye that should not be there if a man jumped from a window. A first phone call made to a CIA supervisor before an ambulance. A physician without psychiatric credentials managing a severe psychotic episode on behalf of an intelligence agency. A document destruction ordered by the CIA's director in anticipation of congressional scrutiny. The counterintelligence chief of the CIA arriving at a hotel room before the police had finished their initial investigation and removing papers from the scene. And 50 years of a family's refusal to accept an official account that the evidence does not support. Eric Olson has spent his adult life on this. He gave up a career. He turned his family home into an archive. He has said in interviews that he cannot stop because stopping would mean accepting that the government's version is true, and he does not believe it is true, and the evidence he has assembled gives him specific and documentable reasons for that belief. The Frank Olson case did not end in 1953. It did not end in 1975, when Gerald Ford apologized. It did not end in 1994, when James Starrs found the hematoma. It is, at the time this documentary was made, still technically an open homicide investigation in Manhattan, and it will remain open until someone tells the truth, or everyone who knows the truth has followed Frank Olson into silence. The broader implication of the Frank Olson case is not limited to one man's death in one hotel room. MKUltra was not an aberration within an otherwise lawful intelligence apparatus. It was the product of a specific institutional logic that has not disappeared from American governance simply because MKUltra was officially ended in 1973. The belief that existential threats justify the suspension of the legal and ethical frameworks that define what America claims to be is not a Cold War artifact. It reappeared after September 11, 2001, in the enhanced interrogation programs and the warrantless surveillance operations that the executive branch authorized in the name of national security, and it produced the same pattern of official concealment, congressional circumvention, and eventual partial disclosure that MKUltra produced. The specific methods change. The institutional logic does not. Frank Olson walked into that logic in 1953 because his expertise was useful to it, and he may have walked too deep and seen too much, and the institution that had found him useful may have decided that the cleanest solution to the problem he represented was a window on the 10th floor of a hotel in November, when the streets below were cold and the body would hit the pavement before anyone could intervene. That is not a proven fact. It is the conclusion that the available evidence most strongly supports, and the difference between those two things is a CIA document room that no longer exists, destroyed by the man who created the program 3 weeks before the congressional investigators arrived.